Okay, I too am going to address critical thinking skill 2 and how I use this in one of the classes that I teach, which is historical, philosophical, and sociological foundations of education. A mouthful for sure for a title of the class. To students that equates to 315. I got to take 315. So the class fits very well with critical thinking skill number 2 because it deals with identifying sources and determining their reliability. At the one thing that I think that as we address these different skills in our classes is that we have a tendency to think, oh no, what am I going to have to add to my class? What extra am I going to have to do to try and infuse critical thinking, blah, blah, blah. And I put up here that I think that this is something that we take for granted, simply meaning you do this in your class. Those of us who are professors who've been through graduate training, this is stuff that you have to do, and it's just done, and stuff that is very natural for us to do. And so, right, this example that I'm going to give you today is something that I did before I got involved in the critical thinking task force doing skill number 2. It's just very easy to highlight and say, here's where I'm doing this. Now maybe I can be a little more intentional about doing that. And so as I give you this idea, hopefully there's something in your class that you're already doing and you have a chance to be a little more intentional about it. I might say too, some of you in here might say, well, you know, it's kind of a history, philosophy stuff. That's not what I do. Well, in your discipline, whatever it may be, there's a history for it. There's a philosophy of it. And whatever that may be, you can find someone somewhere, right, in the theory that you're dealing with where there's an argument. There are going to be people who disagree. There are going to be things that they battle over in terms of what is this all about. And so whatever the discipline is, I think that you'll be able to use this, right? The 3 simple steps to identifying sources and determining their reliability, right? List the possible sources and locations, review reliability factors, and narrow the sources to the most reliable. The reviewing the reliability factors are the things that we really get to focus on with our students. Have you ever thought about this? Have you ever thought about the fact that they might have a unique perspective? Have you ever thought about the fact that maybe this wasn't just all about facts, as Arden showed in his recent article that he found? Maybe there's an agenda here. What is it that the author is trying to convey? What biases do they have? What have they left out? Or what have they overemphasized? Or any of these types of questions up there that you can ask, right? And your students, as you well know, come to class with numerous examples of sources, where they get their information, right? Maybe it's the decline of Western civilization that I would use as an example, the movie The Waterboy, right? I don't know if you've seen The Waterboy, hopefully not. Don't admit it if you have, like I just have, right? There's a scene in there where Adam Sandler, right, his source with the professor in the class every time is mama, right? Mama said, right? His mama said, and eventually the professor has to say, mama's wrong, right? You have to think about the source here. So I am not going to show you that, thankfully, but I am going to give you an example of where I identify sources in this class. I'm going to talk about Horace Mann and the common school movement, right? Horace Mann is rightly called the father of the common school, or public school in America. Got the thing going. Before he came around, we didn't have public schools as we know them today. Sure, we had some schools, but people paid tuition, no one had to go. How did he get this thing moving, and how did it all happen? Now, I don't really use textbooks per se. I use lots of books, but I try and use books that have arguments, right, rather than textbooks. So the students don't buy this textbook, but I bring it down and read this to them. Actually, I copy it for them, but I'll read it to you all. 2 brief little sections about the common schools and its closely related implications of compulsory attendance. The common school. By the early 19th century, as industry became more and more mechanized, it was obvious that workers needed to develop the skills required to operate the increasingly complex machinery. Voluntary philanthropic schools, sponsored by business and industries, were inaugurated. Individual workers saw the schools as the way to educate themselves and improve their position in the workplace. The schools, therefore, met the needs of both worker and employer. Consequently, educators and businessmen began discussing the need for publicly supported education for all children. This ideal was called the common school. Of course, to many, the common school was far more than a means of educating the masses for the workforce. It was an egalitarian and democratic ideal, a means of preserving and strengthening the culture and conveying and reinforcing American values. So, I write on the board, the common school. Right? Here's the historical background for our system that we have. What can you infer from this source that you have here? Why do we have these schools? Would you please list a few things down? And I have them list those down. And then I say, now let me read you one more paragraph on compulsory attendance. Massachusetts enacted the first compulsory attendance statute. Passed in 1852, this law required that all children between 8 and 14 attend school for at least 12 weeks per year. Our year's gotten a little longer. 6 of which had to be consecutive and carried penalties for violators. Throughout the nation and early 20th century, such laws were strengthened by extending age limits, lengthening the school term, and tightening enforcement. However, they did not address equality of educational opportunity intended to interpret, quote-unquote, all children as meaning all white males of economic means. However, compulsory attendance law moved the ideal of common education closer to reality. So then I have them write down, okay, now we're talking about compulsory school laws, laws that say, if you're an American, you're a child, you need to be in school. We think this is of enough value. Why? Write down why, what you can infer from that passage as to why we have compulsory school laws. And then we go to some other sources that this one they actually use in their class, this one they do not. And we begin to talk about, was there something more? What else is involved in here? By the way, I'm sorry to be skipping around as I will do. This typically takes about a class and a half to complete the entire activity of what I'm doing, and so I just have to tell you what it is rather than have you do this activity. So we go to Horace Mann, right? We start reading Horace Mann, what he actually said. Let's see if Horace Mann, the father of the common school, said the exact same things that your textbook did. We begin to address issues about the common school being a divine right, much like a constitutional right, much like life, liberty, and property, or the pursuit of happiness. You have a right to a free education. Why? Or why would this cause problems not to offer this? Horace Mann continually pointed to Europe and he said, look at the tensions over in Europe. Look at this society of class and caste and the problems that it's creating, right? We're on the wake of industrial revolution, right? And challenges and socialism and communism and Marxism. And Horace Mann is saying, you want to know what the great equalizer is? It's not taking all the property from all the rich people and redistributing it. It is providing an education for everyone, regardless. He says if you provide an education for everyone, there is nowhere in the world where there exists an intelligent population that lacks resources, right? That intelligent people tend to produce wealth. They are able to sustain themselves. Okay, so then he talks some about religious education, moral education, and I asked them, well, what about the common schools? Does it talk at all about the necessity for religious and moral education? Of course, that textbook does not mention anything about religious and moral education. And so I read some of Horace Mann. Them read, it is still easier to prove that the Massachusetts school system is not anti-Christian or unchristian. The Bible is the acknowledged expositor of Christianity. In strictness, Christianity has no other authoritative expounder. The Bible is in our common schools by common consent. And if the Bible is in the schools, how can it be said that Christianity is excluded from the schools? Or how can it be said that the school system which adopts and uses the Bible is an anti-Christian or an unchristian system? It is not indeed too plain to require formality of a syllogism. Is it not indeed too plain to require the formality of a syllogism? That if any man's creed is to be found in the Bible, and the Bible is in the schools, then that man's creed is in the schools. He continues to talk about in here how religion is the foundation of morality, and how morality is the foundation of a democracy, right? If you have morality and you have knowledge, then we can keep this thing going. We can have factories in Boston that have workers who are punctual, honest, thrifty, hardworking, and aspire to something else, right? Something more for their lives. We can ensure to the wealthy owners that they're not going to be rude or licentious or not show up or get drunk all the time after work or whatever it is, because they're going to be educated, they're going to be moral. Right? This helps everybody involved, right? And so I begin to say, well, what other differences did you point out? They talk about moral education, they talk about religious education, and then I point out, well, look at the first part of this document. It's a pretty sizable document that they have to read, and I say, the first part, he's on the offensive, right? He's saying, we need this is what it's for, this is what it's all about. But when he gets to religious education, things begin to turn, and he's on the defensive. And I ask him, why? Why is Horace Mann on the defensive when it comes to addressing religion? Why is he upset that he even has to talk about it? I offer you that question. Why do you think that is? Right. Yeah, this is not a sectarian school anymore. It is a common school. So Austin's right. The dilemma is, right, well, it's not sectarian, but it's still Christian, right? We're still going to read the Bible. We're still going to quote passages. We're still going to do these things. So how could people claim this? And there are two groups of people, or two religious denominations, really, that challenge, well, one church, one denomination that really challenge Horace Mann on this. One group is a large group of Presbyterians don't like this. They say, no, this kind of watered down Protestantism is not good. We need Calvinist doctrine. We need true Reformed theology. And if we don't get it, if we acquiesce on this, then it'll be the next thing, then it'll be the next thing, then it'll be the next thing, and before long, we won't have anything but, mushy moralisms. And how does that guide us?
Before long, they won't allow prayer in public schools.
Right. And Horace Mann said, that is absurd. Right? How could you not have that? Okay, so Presbyterians are one group. And then there's a second, much larger, much more controversial. Catholics, right? Catholics have problems with the common school because the common Bible that they're using is the Protestant Bible. And right, the teachers are told that they are supposed to read the Bible only and be silent so that they can return home, and the children will discuss those issues with their parents, and their parents can then talk about whatever the nuances are and what their specific beliefs are. But the Catholics said, well, look at all these other readings. Look at all this other literature. Look at all the anti-Catholic sentiment involved here. And Horace Mann writes, he says, no, we're talking about general odd Christianity, everything that we can agree together upon, right? That's what we're going to focus on. And we need the Catholics to be a part of this system, and we don't want them to separate themselves. Well, in the Northeast, right, Horace Mann is in Massachusetts, but in the Northeast, the common school movement takes off. There are protests in Massachusetts from Catholics, larger protests in New York City from a guy named Bishop John Hughes. They look at some of John Hughes' documents, and John Hughes basically says, here's what you're doing. You're trying to take our children away from us. You're trying to end this affiliation which is based on our conscience, and that's un-American. You shouldn't be able to do that. And numerous common school reformers say that's not the case, that's not true, we are not anti-Christian, but these schools are American and Americans are, right, Protestant. I pulled out one other primary source from this book. This is from Horace Bushnell, who was a longtime common school teacher in the Northeast. He says, it has been clear for some years past from the demonstrations of our Catholic clergy and their people, and particularly of the clergy, that they were preparing for an assault upon the common school system. hitherto in so great faith our countrymen, complaining first of the Bible as a sectarian book in the schools, and then their complaints have begun to be accommodated by modifications that amount to a discontinuance, more or less complete, of religious instruction itself. And then he goes on to talk about all the problems that Catholics have caused in schools and some other particularly offensive things here. Let's see. Right? Our only answer to such demands from the Catholics is no, take your place with us in our common schools and consent to be Americans, or else go back to Turkey where Mohammedans, Greeks, and Armenians and Jews are walled up by the laws themselves, blah, blah, blah. So you begin to understand, man, maybe the Catholics have a point here. Maybe Horace Mann isn't the only one talking about this. Fast forward to the other section, what I was talking about. The common schools become wildly successful. They spread throughout the Northeast, Midwest. They're everywhere, right, except the South. And then I say, well, what about this other side of the chart here, or the other side of the board here, about this idea of compulsory school laws, right? We've got a problem. We've created common schools to help Americanize all these kids. And what's the problem? Mm-hmm. The ones who are there, right? The ones who show up, right? They're worried that they're the Anglo-Saxon, right? The WASP kids. Who's not showing up to school? The Catholics, right? They're not there. They've decided, hey, we're not going to be a part of this system which we find opposed to ourselves. And so I want to point out this other document. I do give this to them. I found this in another book full of primary sources. It's from the Massachusetts Teacher, which is an official journal. It is in October of 1851. All right, we're talking about apparently learned people here, not just your rabble-rousers. Right? Probably an English teacher, Arden. Okay, all right. And here is what the Massachusetts Teacher says. I'll skip a little bit in here, but I want to read some of this. The constantly increasing influx of foreigners during the last 10 years has been and continues to be a cause of serious alarm to the most intelligent of our own people. What will be the ultimate effect of this vast and unexampled immigration is a problem which has engaged the most anxious thought of our best and wisest men. Yes, 1851, not 2010. Right? Will it, like the muddy Missouri as it pours its waters into the clear Mississippi, and contaminate the whole united mass, spread ignorance and vice, crime and disease through our native population? Or can we, by any process, not only preserve ourselves from this threatened demoralization, but improve and purify and make valuable this new element which is thus forced upon us and which we cannot shut out if we would? Right? And I point out to my kids, hey, have you ever been to the Mississippi River in Minnesota? Right, where it's pristine and clear, and you can get in a shallow stream and see your feet, right? And then as you go down further, right, especially after the confluence of the Missouri, what is it the rest of the way down? It's dirty, right? It's contaminated. This is what he's saying. Do we want to contaminate our population with all these immigrants who are coming here? Right? So skip down a couple paragraphs. Our chief difficulty is with the Irish. The Germans, who are next in numbers, will give us trouble, which is kind of interesting. They are more obstinate, more strongly wedded to their own notions and customs than the Irish, but they have inherently the redeeming qualities of industry, frugality, and pride, which will save them from vice and pauperism, and they may be safely left to take care of themselves. But the poor Irish, the downtrodden, priest-ridden of centuries, come to us in another shape. So cheaply have they been held at home, so closely have they been pressed down in the social scale, that for the most part the simple virtues of industry, frugality, temperance, and frugality are unknown to them. And that wholesome pride which induces a German or a Native American to work hard from sun to sun for the smallest wages, right? We can pay them next to nothing, right? Rather than seek or accept charitable aid, has been literally crushed out of them. We speak now of the masses. Last part. Hang with me because this is the most important part. To understand an evil perfectly is a great point gained toward a remedy. In this case, the principal remedial measure stands out so clearly that there can be no mistaking it. With the old, not much can be done, because you can't teach old people new things, right? Yeah. But with their children, the great remedy is education. The rising generation must be taught. Our own children are taught. We say must be, because in many cases, this can only be accomplished by coercion. In too many instances, the parents are unfit guardians of their own children. If left to their direction, the young will be brought up in idle, dissolute, vagrant habits, which will make them worse members of society than their parents are. Instead of filling our public schools, they will find their way into our prisons, houses of correction, and almshouses. Nothing can operate effectually here but a stringent legislation, thoroughly carried out by an efficient police. The children must be gathered up and forced into school. Those who resist or impede, and whether parents or priests, must be held accountable and punished. Right. Following year, Massachusetts passes the first ever compulsory school law in America. Remember our initial secondary source. What's compulsory school law about, and what are the problems? Right? They expand the laws, extend the year, blah, blah, blah. However, they did not address equality of educational opportunity, intended to interpret all children as meaning all white males of economic means. However, compulsory attendance laws move the ideal of common education closer to reality. Wrong. Wrong. Right? The white males with means already had schools. They were already going to schools. Right? The issue here is we need common schools to make these people like us. That's why we have to have them. That's what the primary sources suggest. So how do you go about this, right? And how do I go about determining whether they understand this kind of complex argument that I'm trying to make with them? Well, I have up here for our evaluation activities as easy as ABC, meaning you can, if you want to, have multiple choice questions. Crafted properly, multiple choice questions can address whether or not they indeed have a deep understanding or understanding at some level of what you're dealing with sources. The questions can address sources in general, the specific sources that you have used, and the specific arguments that are being made from different and competing ideas. Right? That's one thing that I use to determine this, and the other is much more detailed. It's a paper, and it's called What Are Schools For? What's the point of this entire thing? You want to be a teacher, you're going to be in this system, what is the point of the system? Right? There are great things about the public school system. Horace Mann talks about the equalizer, the great balance wheel of the social machinery. We're going to give kids who are poor a chance. Right? It doesn't matter where your parents are from or what their occupation is, you can live out your dream because of these schools. Then there's the darker side, right? This is a competing view. There is no one purpose for school, right? There are many, and I use this assignment because I want them to think about how they want to utilize sources and the value in each of those individual sources. Okay, one other thing that I want to talk to you about is I've just recently decided to attempt this activity in my class. Let me show you this one more slide before I go to it. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Neil Postman. Neil Postman he's now deceased. He wrote Amusing Ourselves to Death. After that, he wrote a book called The End of Education, Redefining the Value of School. And he talks about what are schools all about? What's the point of this thing? And so I draw from both of those books. And Using Ourselves to Death, he talks a lot about issues relating to utilizing technology in your classroom, specifically videos, and how we have all these educational videos, and he thinks Sesame Street is awful because Sesame Street is when we first said television isn't just about entertainment. Television is about education or edutainment, right? And that people after Sesame Street stop asking questions like, oh, is that teacher or that professor competent? Did they help me learn the material? Do I have better critical thinking skills? Or post Sesame Street? Was it boring? Was I entertained? That's the kind of thing that he's worried about. And he goes on to say, here are the problems with videos, right? No prerequisites, no perplexity, no dialogue. I kind of explain what those mean. He says every video is made so that you can turn it on and start watching. You don't have to have any background information at all to watch these videos, right? No one says, well, before you purchase this, why don't you go buy these 6 books, check them out, then you can compare them with what we say in our video, then we, talk about it. He says that doesn't happen. Then he says there's no perplexity, that the very nature of what's being done is to simplify. Whereas our job oftentimes is to say, hey, this is really complex. This is a challenge to deal with. Here are all these components that you need to be thinking about. And he says that doesn't happen. Right? And I like the example that I heard about, that you can listen or watch 90 seconds of the nightly news and determine that you are an expert on the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. You know whose problem it is, and you know how you clean it up, and you know who's to blame, right? And exactly how this works, or whatever the issue may be. So he says, we don't have perplexity, and then we don't have dialogue. That reading by nature takes more time, and that time allows us to synthesize our thoughts, think about other arguments, and write letters to editors.